With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. I, of course, am your host, Caleb Colquitt, here for News Radio 1440. And as always, we are going to start with our daily coronavirus update, get you the latest on that and how the state is handling that. And this is the one that we always start with from the Alabama Department of Public Health. We'll take a look at that. So you'll notice, first of all, before we actually get into the raw numbers and data, there have been a few updates to this particular rubric, the display that they're doing. And the Alabama Department of Public Health has also added a tracker to where you can track total hospitalizations. And I think that that's really important because if you'll notice, if we've got almost 2,000, we're literally one away from 2,000, so 1,999. And we only have 240 statewide hospitalizations, that means that really only about 10% of the people that are coming down with this virus have been hospitalized. And you also need to remember and to keep in mind that when you're looking at that, those people aren't all hospitalized at the same time, because this is looking at the hospitalizations since the 13th of March. Which means we're almost an entire month away. And to be honest, I couldn't figure out exactly what the average length of time spent in a hospital for somebody that has COVID-19 was. But if we're estimating it's only 3 or 4 days at a time, at least at the levels that it's at right now, we're looking at something that is not going to cripple our healthcare system or cripple our hospital as it is right now. I do want to make that very, very clear, because that's roughly 10% of all of the cases that have been confirmed that have the virus needing hospitalization. Now, that's still significant. I mean, you know that 10% of the people that get the flu don't need hospitalization. And so when you understand that, you can understand why this virus could be more serious. There's also a ton of new things that they're finding out about this thing. For example, and I didn't know this until a friend of mine who actually had the virus, we talked about her a little bit last week, that she actually lost her sense of taste and smell temporarily, which was really odd. I've never heard of a novel coronavirus, a flu offset or a flu mutation, as it were. Don't, get me bogged down into the scientific details because I'm not nearly smart enough to understand how all of that works, but I've never heard of that causing a symptom that led to a lack of the ability to taste or smell. And another thing that's interesting is that there are a handful of people that are noticing that despite it being a respiratory disease, it is doing damage to people's hearts. Now, on what size and scope and scale, I don't know. I would imagine it's relatively small, considering this thing has been around since January, February, and they're just now getting reports of it having an effect on a person's heart. I would tend to think what that means is that is a legitimate side effect, but one that is relatively rare. And since it's something that we haven't heard a lot about up until this point, there probably is some lasting damage to the heart in the rare cases where it does happen, but probably not something that is going to be ultimately debilitating. You never know with that. Maybe that is the case, and frankly, we're just in a position to where we don't have enough data to say one way or the other on that, but those would be my guesses based on what I've seen about this thing so far. So when we do actually dig into the numbers of this thing, when we do actually look at some of the details in this graphic. For example, like I was showing on this a second ago, Alabama has 1,999 confirmed cases. That is a plus 784 since Thursday. Now, I want you to think about that. We're at just barely under 2,000. And the last time we met on this show on Thursday, the last time we had a coronavirus update, there were 784 fewer confirmed cases. That means not quite half, but about 40-ish% of all the cases in Alabama as of today, Monday, were not around on Thursday. That's a substantial increase. And there's really no way to sugarcoat it. It's a pretty significant jump from where we were. So if you look at this, almost 15,000 tests are now being administered, that have been administered in the state of Alabama. And by the way, that's about 6,000 new tests this weekend. Now, that's not near the 40-ish% mark that we had seen before, which means for the number of cases, we're getting a lot of tests, but that is giving us roughly a 13.5% rate of tests resulting in a positive. Now, that's one of those things that, as I've explained before, you can't really definitively quantify that and say that it is a good or a bad thing, because if only one person has symptoms and needs the test, and he gets the test, that's 100% testing. And a 100% rate would mean that only one person that actually needed the test got the test. Now, granted, with the situation that we're in right now, it's better to have aggressive testing. That's something that's been shown based on nations that do aggressive testing versus nations that don't. I'm not saying that we should just only administer the test only to people that we're almost 100% certain are that. But if we have a higher rate, that means that it is at least possible that a whole bunch of people that aren't getting the test don't need the test. And so that is something to keep in mind. But if you're talking about this is a substantial increase in tests. This is a substantial increase in cases over the weekend. Whether or not I think the two happen to be connected, I don't think that that's, a very big logical leap. I think that it's pretty obvious that we increased our tests and we increased the number of confirmed cases. But I do think that these things are linked, and I wanted to show you this. This, again, is information from the Alabama Department of Public Health. So these are the confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the state of Alabama. You can see where they kind of really start to shoot up. However, what I did want to point out is that these are still numeric increases. They are substantial numeric increases, but they're still numeric increases. They're not exponential increases. And what I mean by that is we haven't had that day where we're doubling or tripling our rate, but this does look like a location in the earlier stages of the Wuhan flu. Because if you've looked at other graphs that chart confirmed cases, whether you're talking about China or Italy, it looks pretty much like that. It looks a lot like that chart that we just saw in the earlier stages, and then they hit that point where there's an exponential spike. They're projecting that our peak here in the state of Alabama is about a couple of weeks away. 2 to 3 is what they're projecting right now, and we did have very big days, both on we did have really, really big days of increases in the week, and I want to go ahead and look at those and talk about exactly what they mean, because these are the single day new cases. So instead of the other one that just shows totals, this chart is specifically looking at new cases per day. So this is really interesting that we had record-breaking, the highest and the second highest day that we've had single day cases were Friday and Sunday. And I do also think it's interesting that you may remember on Thursday, I predicted that Saturday would be the exponential spike. Thank God I was wrong. But I do think it's interesting because I think that as a exercise in making sure Caleb stays humble, I think that what God does is he just occasionally proves me wrong to make sure that I'm staying humble. So maybe I should make outlandish claims more often I think that there's going to be, a whole bunch of new people getting the coronavirus tomorrow, and then the rates will be similar to what they were Saturday, just so God can prove me wrong. Thank you, Lord, for that. I think some humiliation does a soul good every now and then. But, these are very serious numbers, but it's interesting that Saturday was our lowest day since March the 24th. You can see that on that chart here. And so the thing is, typically speaking, when you're talking about data, you don't really want to see data like we just saw there, where it's sporadic. And that's because you look at sporadic data and that tends to tell you nothing. Sometimes telling you nothing can be beneficial, but we're looking at that where we saw the biggest single cases in one day in the state of Alabama, followed by the day with the lowest cases since March 24th, followed by the second highest day, followed by today, which was above our average, but not by much. And so it's an interesting back and forth that we've been having on these charts. Now, these are still numeric spikes. We haven't hit that exponential spike yet, and I hope that we don't, but so far we have not done so. But the lack of consistency in some ways might actually be a good thing, because what you have seen with new cases in other places is that they continue to go up before they peak, and then they finally start seeing some relief. That's not what's happening in Alabama. We're getting some days where we have a lot of new cases. We're getting some days where we don't have very many cases, and then we're having some that are about average. Now, unfortunately for us, comparing the 4 days since we've been here, 2 of those days happen to be the biggest 2 that we've had since we started tracking this stuff. So still an exponential increase, and there's no way to sugarcoat that. I'm not trying to detract from that at all. But I'm saying the fact that we're not consistently seeing giant spikes like this, giant increases, and every day is more cases, more new cases than we had the day before, I think what that indicates is that the measures that we are taking are having some effect. So what it seems to indicate for me doesn't mean that it's not going to be bad, doesn't mean that our healthcare system is not going to be overwhelmed, and it does not mean that we're going to see some very real-world economic and, from just a health standpoint, some hits to our healthcare system. But what it does mean is it doesn't look like we're following the pattern of other nations like Italy, like Spain, like China, that had these wild exponential spikes that just overwhelmed their system completely, and they kind of stayed in that overwhelmed state for about 2 or 3 weeks at a time and had mass casualties because of it. So I'm just saying that the inconsistency actually is a good sign, and it means there is hope as long as there hasn't been a significant drop-off in testing. In other words, if you see a big drop in new confirmed cases, but you also see a gigantic drop in new tests, well, that probably means that people out there are still getting sick. You're just not testing at the rate that you should. But at least based on recent data, Alabama's testing has been pretty decent compared to our previous testing. Remember, I'm comparing us to us right now. I'm not comparing us to anybody else. But compared to our previous testing, the testing that we've done in the past few days has been pretty much the same as we've been experiencing beforehand, in that it's continuing to improve, it's continuing to get better. And like I said in the report earlier, we are dramatically increasing our test with about 6,000-ish over the weekend. Considering our total is 15,000, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good rate of return. That's a pretty good rate of improvement. And so it doesn't look like our testing is dropping off, yet our numbers on new cases seem to be somewhat sporadic and hard to predict. And that just means that we haven't hit that incline where it just continues to climb up and up and up very quickly, which means that we may have done quite a bit to flatten out the curve, which is what all the models are asking us to do and what the doctors are asking us to do. So it looks like what we are doing thus far has had some effect. Now, looking at some other things, because I did want to ask this question, And this is going to be sort of the focus of the episode today because I think it's really important, and it's been a while since I've done some state-by-state comparisons to help us understand where we are and how we're doing. So how is Alabama doing compared to other states in the country? Well, there's a couple of rubrics I'd like for us to look at. First of all, this is just the map, and this is the one that's done by the CDC comparing states to other states and where the coronavirus hotspots are. Frankly, I'm kind of surprised that they have not changed the numbers, because I really thought that there would be a separate category for 10,000 or more by this point, considering that we're approaching, unfortunately, the point where that could very well be relevant. But if you're looking at this map right now, you can see that Alabama is in the 1,000 to 5,000 range, and that's not good compared to the rest of the states. In fact, if I was looking at this and I looked at the raw numbers, not just the categories, that means that if you're looking at it compared to other states, Alabama is currently in 25th place. And that's, this is one of the things where you really don't want to be higher in. You really don't want to be number one or in the top 10 or whatever. This is one where you'd much rather be in the bottom. And you'll remember that just a few weeks ago when we looked at this, we were in 31st place. So we're still roughly middle of the pack, but we've been climbing those places, and I would hate for Alabama to climb any higher than they already are. Of course, I'd rather just for the entire country this thing just stop, but that's not how the world works. So if we're sitting at 25th right now as opposed to 31st, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it could be that we're just getting sicker than some of the other states at a faster rate. Possible. I think it's more likely that what happened is we have been amping up our testing, and that has caused us to climb in the rankings and more accurately reflect where we actually always were. I think that when we were looking back at this a couple of weeks ago and we were 31st, we were probably actually about 25th, but we were not testing quite as aggressively. So that becomes the really important rubric to look at, because are we really doing about middle of the pack? Are we really roughly in the middle of this thing? And there's some states doing better than us. There's some doing worse. But the point is, now we're in the top 25. We're in the top half of cases for states. And so that's really the question. How much testing are we doing? And there's a couple of graphics that I want us to look at that I think will help us understand exactly where we stand on that compared to our other states. So if you look here, this is a tracker that was put together by Johns Hopkins, and they are studying specifically the amount of testing that is happening within states. And you can see right there, I have it set to Alabama. And Alabama is below average. You can see in that little pink line there is us, and then the United States total average is right there. And you have to remember also, this is adjusted for population. So to compare apples to apples, because it makes no sense to compare a state like Alabama to a state like Texas when they have so many more people than us, you adjust for population, and then you get a much more realistic picture as to how we're doing. So that's the United States average per capita testing, and then that's us. And if you're looking at that green line, the United States average is 103 per 100,000, which is roughly a 0.1% rate of the population tested. Alabama has significantly less than that. In fact, it has almost a third of that. So Alabama has about 36 per 100,000. And remember that this is cases, not testing. So these are coronavirus cases. And if we're at 36 and America's at 103, that means about 0.1% of the American population currently has been confirmed to have the coronavirus. A much smaller percentage of that for Alabama's, that would be 0.04. So we're doing a lot better than the rest of the country when it comes to confirmed cases. Now, just so we're comparing even more apples to apples, let's look at states that have similar cultures to us, similar population sizes that are close by. So it makes the most sense, even though Florida has a lot more people than us, and Georgia used to be about the same, but they've grown population-wise considerably as well. we're just going to look at our neighbors because they have similar, and if you adjust for population, then that takes the population question out of it. And so we're looking at states with similar cultures, spread out more rural areas than some of the states in the north. It wouldn't make much sense to compare Alabama to New Jersey, for example. Let's look at their confirmed cases and see how they're doing. So based on that same rubric that was put together by Johns Hopkins, Alabama has 36 per 100,000 with confirmed COVID-19 cases. Georgia has 63 per 100,000. So that's significantly more than us. That's almost double. Mississippi has 55 per 100,000. Tennessee has 53 per 100,000. And Florida has 58 per 100,000. Now, that's good news, because that means compared to our neighbors, Alabama has significantly less coronavirus confirmed cases than our neighbors do. So we are Kung Flu fighting very well. We're doing a good job on fighting that Kung Flu. So is Alabama, if we're significantly below average, compared both to the United States, which has 103, and then Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Florida, all of which have below average compared to the United States, but also still have more than Alabama, that means we're doing pretty well, right? That means Alabama is actually, if you're adjusting for population, doing really, really well if you're looking at how many cases of coronavirus that we have. Except you do have to ask the question, and I think it's a fair question, are we testing? Are we testing as much as our neighbors? Because if you were super aggressively testing, you would undoubtedly get several more cases that are not maybe severe, maybe even that are asymptomatic entirely. But you're going to have more total cases, which is going to be a larger portion of your population, which would mean that even though it seems like we're doing really well, even compared to Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Florida, that maybe we're not. So let's dig into that question. How are we doing on testing? Are we significantly below average on testing as well? Because that might explain the discrepancy between our neighbors. So for that, let's go ahead and look at this last graphic. This is one that was put together by Vox News, and it doesn't have all 50 states. I just highlighted Alabama and showed where we were. So this is a testing percentage per million people. So I adjusted it to 100,000 just so it's something that we can adequately compare to. And you'll notice that the rate, if you adjust it per 100,000, move the decimal place, we're at 268 per 100,000 of the citizens of Alabama that are tested. Now, they're using numbers that are similar to ours, but we had to adjust a little bit because I believe that theirs is a little bit behind ours. They're, if I'm not mistaken, a day behind us. So this is using testing numbers from yesterday, but it's pretty close because we're looking at numbers that are comparable to the numbers we have today. And remember, every other state is also being compared to how they were doing yesterday as opposed to today as well on that graph. So on testing, we are at 268 per 100,000. That's not good, because that actually puts us at 45th. If you're comparing us to the other states, and I'm just including states, not District of Columbia or any territories, if you're looking at just us compared to the other 50 states, that puts us at 45th. Not a good place to be. So if you're comparing that to maybe some of our neighbors, because that might, again, give us a better understanding of how well we're doing compared to them, similar cultures, so on and so forth. How are they doing? How do they stack up? Well, the good news is that puts us pretty close to our neighbors, Mississippi and Georgia. Mississippi is actually 49th, so they're performing even worse than we are, and the same could be said for Georgia, which is directly below us at 46th. So their testing is roughly the same as our rate of testing. However, we are nowhere near our neighbors, Florida or Tennessee. Florida, which is at 22nd, Tennessee, which is at 13th, and both of these states have a rate of testing that is over double what ours is. So, comparatively, we're doing better than Mississippi and Georgia, but we're not testing nearly as aggressively as Florida and Tennessee if you're adjusting those figures to compare our population to their population on an even playing field. So what does all that mean? Because I know I just threw a whole bunch of information at you and you're probably in a little bit of overload mode right now. So I'm going to try to sum this up and sum up this data as succinctly as I can. It is possible that being behind means that we have more cases. That's just reality. It is possible the fact that we are not testing as aggressively as our neighbors means that, or just other states in general, but specifically our neighbors, the states that surround us. It means that probably what's happening is we are not testing as well as we could, and that probably means we're missing a lot of cases, which means our level of confirmed cases is relatively low because we're not testing as well. And so that's what it seems to bear out. However, it is also possible that we have less testing because we have less people that are symptomatic. This is the problem that you run into when you're dealing with something like this that is on a voluntary basis. It is possible the state of Alabama is just less sick than those states. And because of that, less people are going in to get tested. For example, if I went in and got tested, it would improve our testing numbers, but decrease our actual confirmed cases. But at the same time, that would also be a waste of resources. And so you could have an awful lot of people like me that just haven't got the test because they don't have symptoms yet. And so Alabama really is healthier. And the reason that we're not testing as much is not because we're not doing everything we can and we're not taking measures comparable to Georgia and Tennessee, but simply because people aren't going to get tested just because they don't see the point in it. They don't have symptoms and there's no reason for them to believe that they have it. And just like we've been trying to instruct people, if you don't have reason to believe that you have this thing, then don't waste those resources that could be used on somebody that is legitimately sick. That's a very realistic reading of the data. So it's possible that our lack of testing is contributing to our low numbers. It's also possible that they're not. It's most likely that the answer is somewhere in the middle. That we legitimately do have less people that are sick, and that's the reason that less people are going in to get tested. Because if you were really symptomatic in this thing, I imagine that most reasonable people would go in and get tested just in case, even if it winds up being a head cold or something. You would go in and check it out just to see if that's reality or not. I mean, most reasonable people would do so. And so what's probably going on is we are legitimately less sick, but there are also a lot more tests out there because we are less sick that are contributing to our numbers. So that's where I kind of think that we are right now. If we were to beef up our testing to Tennessee's rate, that means we would have tested about double the amount that we have right now, 29,000. Because remember, we're just barely under 15,000. If we did so at Tennessee's rate, we would be doing so roughly at 30,000. And if our positive rate stayed roughly the same, 13.5, remember that's the rate of people that we have testing positively. If we were more aggressive on testing, there is a good chance that percentage rate would actually drop. However, let's just give the benefit of the doubt and say that 13.5% holds, even if we were aggressively testing in a lot of people that did not have the Wuhan flu were actually getting tested for it. Let's just assume that rate stays constant. Even then, that would still only give us 3,959 cases, so barely under 4,000 cases, roughly double what we have right now. And if you adjust that for population, that puts us roughly on par with Mississippi and Georgia. So we would be about the same as our neighbors, as opposed to significantly better if you were looking at our number of confirmed cases. And like I said, it's more likely that the answer is somewhere in the middle, that we are missing some cases, but we also are just getting tested less because there's less people that are symptomatic. So realistically, and granted, there's a lot of guesswork going into this, but I just have to deal with the data that I have and make a projection based on that. Based on that, we're probably somewhere in the middle-ish, which means we'd get maybe a 50% increase if we were testing much more aggressively. And that would leave us still a little bit better off than Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida. Not by nearly as much, though. I mean, right now, we're at roughly half their confirmed cases. We'd be more like at 75% of the number of cases they have, if my guesstimation would be correct. That's speculation, but I think it's one that makes a lot of sense. So we are legitimately less sick than the other states, but we could do better on testing. And that might increase those rates to be comparable to what theirs are. So you have to also keep in mind, though, that Mississippi and Georgia scored worse than we did on the testing, which means if our rates would necessarily go up of confirmed cases, then if you were to adjust their rates, well, you'd have to be fair, assume that they'd go up by roughly the same amount. So if increasing to this point would only put us, a little bit under where Mississippi and Georgia are, to be fair to compare them, you'd have to compare at least Mississippi and Georgia. Tennessee and Florida, not so much, because like I said, they're already testing at about double our rate. But if you were to adjust Mississippi and Georgia to do the same, their rates would have to go up too to make it a fair comparison. So it seems as though Alabama is legitimately less affected by the coronavirus than these other two states. I don't know why. I'm not sure. But I guess it's something to be thankful for, is the only way that I can put that. So it could be our lack of testing that makes us look a lot better than we are, but it also could be that we're testing less because we're in better shape, is kind of the too long didn't read version of that whole speech I just gave. So unfortunately, this reminds me of a report that I read one time on how lightning works, written by an environmental scientist, and the way that it ended was, but the thing is, we don't know. So it was like a 19-page long report on lightning, and it said, but a lot of this is speculation and we're not sure. And that's how the end of it was, about why the phenomenon of lightning takes place. And so I kind of feel like the professor that wrote this thing, that I gave a long, well-researched academic opinion on all of this and what these numbers mean. But ultimately, if I'm being honest, and that's part of my job too, that all comes down to say it's basically a big question mark right now. I've done a lot of speculation. I've done a lot of guesses on what I think, fiddling with the numbers would do, and trying to get as close to a realistic number as possible. But ultimately, there's just not enough data. And I know that that's super frustrating, but with dealing with this pandemic, that's going to be the answer to a lot of your questions. And I hate that, and especially as somebody who wants to have all the information, that drives me up a wall. But that's the realistic answer for a lot of these things. So is Alabama testing enough? Maybe. Is Alabama legitimately better off than its surrounding neighbors that border its states? Maybe. And the really big unknown that I think a lot of people are asking is, what effect is this going to have on the economy? We don't know. Unfortunately, we're in uncharted waters, and the thing about uncharted waters is you don't know what you're going to come up across next. So I hate that this is my answer, but on whether or not Alabama is testing enough, or whether Alabama is actually legitimately less sick, which it appears to be based on the data, than its surrounding neighbors and other states comparatively, I don't know. Hopefully we'll find out, and if you do want to keep up to date on the data and look at it and every day come by and make sure that you're up to date on that, this is the place to do it. But I can't give you any conclusive answers right now until I have more data to work with. And that's one thing that's really frustrating about this is, the truth is, to have real good, useful data, we're probably just going to have to go through it. Just like the first time you go through a new area on the map, you just have a big blank slate, and the only way to fill in the corners of that map is to actually go there. Well, it would be nice to have the map ahead of time so you know where you're going, but that's not possible. You've got to chart it out. And so because we are in uncharted waters at this point, the best that we can do is fill in that map as we go along. We'll take a quick break here and we'll be back in just a moment on tactics.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will be from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verses 2 through 10. And a centurion's slave was sick and about to die. When he had heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come save the life of his slave. When they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built our synagogue." Now Jesus was triggered upon hearing this and said, "None of the good things he has done matter, because he is a slave owner, and we must never admit that anyone that ever owned slaves is capable of doing anything good. Furthermore, instead of asking me for help, you should have passed universal health care by now so that he could receive treatment for free." Then Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man placed under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it." Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, "I say to you, this man is engaged in systematic oppression. He is clearly engaging in wage slavery by controlling the means of production to exploit the labor of those around him." Then Jesus gathered up a mob and protested on the centurion's lawn all night long with torches and signs reading, "Down with the patriarchy," terrifying him and his family. We never really found out what happened to the centurion's slave. Wow. So inspiring. Thank you for listening to this reading of the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics. Governor Ivey issues a stay-at-home order. You may remember that this happened on Friday, and since we don't have a show on Friday, I haven't had time to report on it. Now, personally, well, I don't even want to put that disclaimer on it. So the thing is, based on all the data that I've looked at, I have seen no evidence, no conclusive evidence, but really not even non-conclusive evidence, just no evidence to really suggest that the stay-at-home order actually does any good. Now, if you want a longer explanation on that, it's about 7 or 8 minutes long. That explanation is here on YouTube. I did a very recent video on it, so it should be in the recent upload section. So just look for stay-at-home orders don't help. If you want a lengthier description of what I put in that particular one to explain why I don't think the stay-at-home orders are actually having any real effect. I don't think that they're necessarily negatively affecting the spread of the virus. I just don't think that they're helping prevent it. But with Governor Ivey's new stay-at-home order, I've seen very little evidence that these things are actually doing anything to help. But the thing is, this one doesn't really change much, and they're not too dissimilar to ones that other states have put out. So it's not like, oh, all the other states' stay-at-home orders, those are really doing something, but this one doesn't. No, it's pretty standard. But the thing is, I think that once you read this, you'll understand why it's not doing much. And why the ones in other states don't seem to be having much of an impact either. So here's a section that really kind of outlines the things that you're allowed to leave the house for now that the stay-at-home order has been put into place. And this is just a small snippet because there are actually 11 pages of exceptions to be able to go out despite the stay-at-home order. Now, here's one that covers, this section is called "To Obtain Necessary Supplies." And then Section 1, food and other consumer goods necessary to maintain a person's daily routine or to maintain the safety, sanitation, and routine operation of a home or residence. And then a little bit further down in section 6, sorry. Any other supplies necessary to maintain a person's or a pet's daily routine or to maintain the safety, sanitation, and routine of operation of a home or residence. Do you already see how this thing is worded so incredibly vaguely that just about any excuse you could think of to leave your home qualifies? Now, granted, going to a football game, or going to a concert, or going to any kind of big public event, that would not be allowed under this. But those things have all been canceled anyway. So, really, what the stay-at-home order does is nothing. And if you can look at that, the one that was really the kicker for me was anything to maintain your daily routine. And the reason that's in there, I'm guessing, is because they wanted to make it clear that, well, you're allowed to go out and, for example, run in the park and work out. Well, that's maintaining your daily routine that fits that qualification for a reason and excuse that is allowable under the law to leave your house, and that's fine. I mean, as long as you're not running near somebody, there's very little chance that you're going to wind up getting somebody else sick or getting sick yourself doing that. I'm not saying that that's a bad reason, but what I am saying is that these things are so wide open that it really doesn't make sense that they're in place. I mean, it seems kind of like, and this is an extreme example, I know, but I'm using it to illustrate my point. It's kind of like the law in, no, actually, it's the opposite of that. It's more like the law that you're not, the goofy laws that you'll see sometimes on websites, like you're not allowed to walk around with an ice cream cone in your back pocket. You're like, well, yeah, but nobody was doing that in the first place. And so it's one of those laws that, like, well, you're not allowed to go to a baseball game. Well, yeah, all the baseball games have been canceled, so not really an issue. And I think that this gets to the heart of the problem here, is that this is largely a symbolic gesture. I don't think that anybody's going to be sent to jail for disobeying this thing, because let's say that a police officer does pull you over and you're like, oh, I'm going to the park to run. Well, according to this, that is a 100% legitimate excuse for leaving your home. Well, I'm going to pick up dog food. Well, that's a legitimate excuse. That is maintaining your pet, which is a household member according to this law. Well, I'm going out to get groceries. I'm going to work. Any of those things, they all qualify for that. And that's the thing about this. This thing is 11 pages long of all the exceptions that a person can meet to qualify to leave their home. And it's pretty much every reason that anybody would ever want to leave their home anyway. So it's a really odd thing that they're doing, that they're saying you can't leave your home except for all of these reasons, and it's basically every reason you could possibly think of. So I don't really see what this does except symbolically announce that we are putting this thing in place, despite the fact that the vast majority of people were already doing this stuff anyway. And that's what really just boggles my mind about this. These rules might make a tiny bit of difference to some people that were somewhat irresponsible and were not already doing these things. For example, the person that was going to a house party, because that's something that wouldn't meet the qualifications under the stay-at-home order. So let's say that there's a bunch of college students or younger people that just aren't worried about the virus, and they were going to go out and have a house party. Okay, well, that might stop some of that, maybe. But if you were this person and you were bound and determined to do so and you weren't worried about the risk, do you really think a person that is that reckless and irresponsible is going to get pulled over by a cop and say, yeah, we're going to a house party? I'm going to guess not. And that's really what I'm saying here, is that all you have to do is say, like, oh, I'm going to get groceries. Oh, I'm going to see my family. Oh, I'm out of, dog food and I've got to go pick that up. So the number, and unless the cop like follows the guy to PetSmart, which I kind of doubt he's going to do, there's no way to prove that. And even then, the guy could look in his rear view, see that the cop is tailing him, and drive to PetSmart. Like, that's the thing that's so ridiculous about this, is that they act as though this is going to be something that actually affects him. And let's say even that he was going to somebody's house to hang out. All he has to do is lie and say that's where he was going, or that this person is a member of the family, and that qualifies. So the people that are reckless and irresponsible and just ignoring this, they're going to ignore it anyway. They're going to do exactly the same thing that they were beforehand. And the people that were responsible, they're going to adhere to this to the best of their ability, but they would have been the people that were responsible in social distancing themselves and doing everything they could to limit their social interaction with people in the outside world already. And so it's very much similar to the gun control debate, where the only people that would be willing to break the gun control laws would indeed be the criminals themselves. And so the laws are aimed at a demographic that specifically would not have adhered to the law regardless of what the law was. And the only thing that it winds up pigeon-toeing is the law-abiding citizen, except in this case, it doesn't even really do that, because there's not going to be a whole bunch of responsible people that decide to ignore the social distancing measures anyway. They're going to voluntarily do that, and did so long before this issue was put in place. And this is one of the main reasons why I just don't think these things actually are going to make a difference. But this is going to be, because of course the name of the show is Tactics, and we specifically try to put this show on so that you understand how to debate with somebody, how to have a conversation with somebody in a meaningful way. So let's go ahead and break this down, because this is a common debating snafu that a lot of people run into. What they'll typically do is they conflate the disagreement with a policy being implemented with the policy's intended purpose. So this is a very common thing, and a lot of people got very upset with me after issuing my previous segment about stay-at-home orders not working. One of the most common issues that I had with the different people that tried to start an argument with me is that they all did this one particular thing. And by the way, this is something to avoid in your future conversations and to point it out if somebody tries to do this to you. What they do is they conflate the intended purpose of a law or a policy with its result. So in other words, you've heard this 1,000 times, you probably just didn't recognize it. This happens all the time, for example, in healthcare. If you are either against Obamacare or you are against the proposal of socialized medicine, Medicare for all, whatever label you want to slap on it, the immediate comeback is, oh, it's because you don't like healthcare and you want people to die. Well, no, that's not it. I think that the intended goal, which is to get people health care, is not going to be accomplished. Because if I believe that socialized medicine was going to work, I'd support it. I'm not against people having health care. I am against socialized medicine because I believe that it will be a failure and it would actually keep people from getting the health care that they deserve. Socialism as a whole is kind of in the same boat. I don't disagree with the intended purpose of socialism. The intended purpose, of course, being equality for everybody. I agree with equality for everybody. I think that's a good thing. I just think that the things that socialism tries to do to accomplish that goal are incorrect. The stay-at-home order is no different. Like I said, the common mistake that a lot of people made in debating with me on this is they said, I don't understand, I had 2 or 3 people bring this point up. Well, of course, if you make people stay at home, then they are going to not spread the virus as quickly. I didn't say that. What I'm saying is people are already staying at home, and the ones that aren't are going to find a very easy workaround for this. So it's not going to change anything. Of course, staying at home and not being around other people is going to prevent the spread of an infectious disease. What I'm saying is the stay-at-home orders themselves are not going to do anything to curtail that. That's the issue that I'm bringing up. And so ultimately, that's where we come into, and like I said, it's just like the argument with a number of different things. Socialism, healthcare, the welfare state, any of those things. If you are against welfare, for example, it does not mean you are in favor of poverty. It just means that, at least in most cases, the reason a person opposes it is because they're saying the system doesn't work, the policy doesn't work, it does not achieve its intended goal. And by the way, this is just a general rule in debate as well. It's always better to not assume malevolence. Unless there is a good reason to assume malevolence, in other words, some kind of ill intent, it's typically better to assume that the person is just incompetent or wrong. Because people are incompetent and wrong all the time. I'm incompetent from time to time. Sometimes I'm wrong. That's just a human trait. And so sometimes I'm in a debate and I realize that my position is the incorrect one because I'm presented with new information. That's a very human thing to have to deal with. But if you assume the other person is evil, if you assume that the other person is just a terrible human being, which is typically what happens in the examples I gave earlier, whether it was socialism, healthcare, welfare, whatever else you may want to go with, if you assume that the other person is evil and just doesn't care about people, then A, that's going to make them significantly less likely to listen to your position, because when they do, they're going to assume that you think that they're a bad person, and that the only reason you're holding the position that you are is because you are a bad person, and because of that, they're a lot less likely to listen to you, because if somebody assumes that you're just a monster or a Nazi or something like that, of course you're going to have a hard time convincing that person to at least listen to you and consider your position. And second of all, normally it's just not true. So when people do assume malevolence, they're usually doing so when it's not actually there. Now, in politics, it is true that occasionally people do have evil intention. Sometimes you have somebody like a Governor Bentley or a Mike Hubbard that do things in their official capacity as an elected official to somehow benefit themselves. But a lot of times, people don't have any malevolence per se. They're just human beings and they're, incompetent. A lot of times that tends to be what happens. And so, as a general rule, there's nothing wrong with pointing out malevolence when you actually detect it and when it's actually there. That's actually a good thing to do, because the other person may not even realize they have that evil intent. But ultimately, it's usually a last resort, not a good first resort. It's not something that you should jump to immediately. Assume that the person is either ignorant or incompetent or something along those lines. It's always better to assume that before you assume that the person is just a horrible person. And speaking of this, I do want to give Meemaw Kay a compliment here, because I do think that she deserves it. This may be the smartest political move Meemaw Kay has ever pulled, because when she did offer up this stay-at-home order, which I may disagree with the policy, but I have to, as a student of politics, applaud the politics here. The way that she sold it and the way that she tried to convince other people to abide by it was actually quite clever. So this is how she motivated people to stay home. I'll read this direct quote from Governor Ivey at the press conference on Friday. "If you're eager for a fall football season coming up, what we're doing today gives us a better chance of being able to do that as well." Man, you want to motivate people in the state of Alabama to do something, connect it to football. It works every single time. And so Governor Ivey saying, look, we may not have a football season coming up this year. You may not be able to see the Tide or the Tigers playing football. Boy, you want to get some people in Alabama motivated to knock this thing out? That's the way to do it right there. Well done, Grandma Kay. But if you want to go even more on point when it comes to the state of Alabama, afterwards she read a Bible verse to close it out. So, I mean, that's about as Alabama as it gets. Motivate people by saying, I love this because Meemaw Kay, I give that moniker tongue-in-cheek, of course, but it was a very Meemaw thing to do. Like, all right, now if you mind me and you stay in your room like I told you to, we get to have football later. So it's just a very grandma thing to do, but I love it. I thought that it was actually very smart, and then reads a Bible verse to drive her point home. So, there you go, Grandma Kay. I appreciate it. God bless our state, because we need it right now, and we're going to need it for a while. But I do think that our state is actually doing some really cool things that I do want to talk about, because I don't want the whole thing to be doom and gloom. I do want to talk about some things that really should give us hope. And I'm not just saying this because I want to spin a story in the right way so that it seems more hopeful. No, I really do see a lot of things on the horizon that look really good. I think there's a lot of really bad, but I think that these are some reasons that we have some hope here. So Auburn University, I got to praise Alabama on Thursday for some of the things that they were doing, and also UAB earlier in the week for some of the things that they were doing. Auburn University, my own alma mater, my beloved Tigers, they're doing quite a few things to help out with this crisis. So this is an article from AL.com. Headline, "It's Given Me Hope. Auburn engineers use CPAP to make emergency ventilator to fill COVID-19 command." This is really cool. A team of engineers at Auburn University have developed an attachment to easily convert CPAP machines into ventilators in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Michael Zabala, an engineer professor at Auburn, and his colleagues spent the last 2 weeks in his home garage developing the reinvent attachment after learning about the United States ventilator shortage. The device can be used with a CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure machine used to treat sleep apnea, and assemble ventilators to treat patients with COVID-19. Now, this is really cool, obviously, because it's a person in the state of Alabama, a person that works for one of our state universities, and his colleagues coming up with something that could save no telling how many lives, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives if this thing is implemented all across the state. And the cost is significantly less than it would be to build new ventilators if they can just repurpose your sleep apnea devices, because there's got to be no telling how many thousands of these things all over the United States. And this would be one way also that citizens could really do something cool. So I used to have a roommate, for example, that had sleep apnea, and he had a CPAP machine. I know that there's other people that have them, and especially in a state like Alabama that might be hit really hard because we have an older population than the state surrounding us. Well, that also means that they are more likely to have devices like a CPAP machine, which means that this might be something that really offsets the human cost, not only in Alabama, but in other states that have similar demographics that have an older population. For example, Florida. This could really help them because they have such an old average age, and they're a very old state compared to some of their neighbors. Well, a lot of those people probably have sleep apnea machines like CPAP that you could attach this thing to, and it's also very similar to another news story that I was reading recently. There was I believe a nurse. I don't even think it was a doctor. I'm pretty sure it was a nurse that was saying that they needed this one particular mechanism that they were out of. It was some kind of attachment for a ventilator, and she got in touch with a nearby university that had a 3D printer, and she said, "Hey, can you print this part?" And they said, "Well, let us take a look at it." And they did, and she gave them one of the parts that they had left over, and they were able to print it at a fraction of the cost, and they were able to print them much faster than the manufacturer was going to be able to put them out, and that probably saved some lives, or at the very least made things easier for that hospital. And so it's really cool to see people from all around the country, pulling together to try to help each other with this. And this is just a great example of it from our own state. I wanted to read this next little section because it says something interesting here too. This is a quote by Zabla. "I spent a lot of time developing a 2-hour lecture on the biomechanics of singing, which educated me tremendously in the area of anatomy associated with breathing and the physics that go behind it and other areas of the field that I really think paid off in this particular process," Zabla said. "The reinvent device can be assembled in 4 hours with $700 in component parts in addition to the standard CPAP machine. The emergency ventilator system is made up from the CPAP machine, the reinvent valve assembly and tubing used in ventilators. The group of Auburn engineers worked with Dr. Glenn Woods, an anesthesiologist in Auburn, so another Auburn man helping out with this, to develop the device, and is in the process of working with a local company in Auburn to help start the manufacturing devices. So you see, two really cool aspects about this is that you have those two forces coming together, an anesthesiologist that works at Auburn and an engineering professor that works at Auburn coming together to collaborate their work on this. And then they also work with a private company there in Auburn, another local business, to help develop the thing and mass produce it. I mean, if this isn't America in a nutshell, I don't know what is. The story of people getting together, working together to help out their fellow man and doing it, to benefit them. This is just a massive nod. It's not the only example. It's just a nod, and it shows the kind of ingenuity that people have all over the country. And this is happening everywhere. There are tons of small businesses, private businesses, completely retooling their factories and their jobs and even reteaching their employees, all to help out with this crisis. I know one thing that was really cool that was talked about recently in the news, Mike Lindell, the guy who owns MyPillow, repurposing his factories to make like surgical masks and different things like that. We've talked about different car manufacturers figuring out ways to make ventilators for the demand that's coming. This is one of the reasons that even though I know that what's coming is bad, and I'm not trying to downplay that at all, I know that it's going to be very hard for a lot of people. But what I am saying here is there is a lot of reason to be hopeful. We're Americans. This is who we are. We're the people that go to the moon and defeat the Nazis. We'll be okay. Our people are strong, they're intelligent, and when you open this thing up to the free market, there's no problem that we can't solve. Sometimes it takes a little time. Sometimes we've got to get our bearings and get our sea legs under us before we can do that. But, I mean, come on. We'll be able to handle this. And you have to keep in mind that all of these models that we're looking at, all of the things that we're seeing, they all ignore this stuff. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't, because they should. That's how you don't deal with data you don't already have. You have to deal with what you've got. I'm not saying the models are bad. I'm just saying that you have to keep in mind that they don't take into account guys like this that see a problem, and within just a few weeks of the problem being made aware of it, they come together with other Americans to figure out a way to make it work. I mean, that's the story of America in a nutshell. And if you want to go even further than this, here's another one, another story about another Auburn person. So Auburn University grad student helped to develop a COVID-19 test widely used in Alabama. This is the headline from AL.com. An Auburn University graduate student played a key role in helping a Birmingham company that brought a COVID-19 test from development to a clinic in less than 2 weeks, and has produced more than 12,000 coronavirus test kits for use in Alabama and elsewhere. Richard Cullum, an Auburn University doctorate candidate in chemical engineering who earned his bachelor's degree at the University of South Alabama, works for Assurance Scientific Laboratories in Birmingham as a member of a research and development team that created the test. And then you skip down a little bit here. Assurance Scientific was one of the first commercial labs in the United States approved by the FDA for COVID-19 testing. Our COVID-19 test uses real-time reverse transcription polymerase chain reduction. I don't understand what that means, but work with me here. This is a little bit over my head. I'm not a chemical engineer. To detect SARS-CoV-2, that's the virus that creates the COVID-19. It says that in the article. The virus that causes COVID-19 in upper and lower respiratory specimens, Coleman said. Quote, "We're relieved to see other commercial labs in the state and throughout the country now able to offer the testing and hope that more will continue to come on board each day to help with the demand, Thomas said. Quote, "We have new machinery arriving daily and are continually adding staff members," said Dr. Chad Austin, co-founder of Assurance Scientific. "This will allow us to double our current capacity within the month to meet the overwhelming demand." You know, I think that kind of going back to the discussion we were having after we read the previous article, this is really kind of the same thing. And one of the things that is illustrated so well in this article is that the FDA would not approve the test for a long time. In fact, if you are looking at some of the research, because a lot of people are holding up South Korea as the golden standard to deal with this thing now, looking aside from the things that would be a massive constitutional violation if they tried them here, like having individuals with the coronavirus being actually tracked on GPS on their phone and other people being able to look at that and see where all the people with corona are. I mean, massive constitutional problems and a HIPAA violation on top of all that going into that. But even if you ignore that aspect of it, part of the reason that they were able to do this, according to their own government, is that immediately when they heard about this problem, they got their private sector involved in creating new tests. In America, the FDA did not approve private companies and private labs for doing stuff like this until just a couple weeks ago, and when they did, we started seeing new tests like every day. There was new news almost every single day that a new test had come out. And we went from a test that takes about 2-3 days and didn't have a very accurate, it was mostly accurate, but you could occasionally get a false negative or a false positive. And we took it from that to, in a matter of a couple of weeks, which is like light speed in medical terms, in the time that it normally takes for medical innovation to take place. We went from that to something that takes less than 15 minutes to get a result on and only takes about a minute to get a sample to be able to test a person. I mean, that's insane, but that's America. That's who we are. You get the private sector involved in this, you get American ingenuity and American industry involved in this, there's nothing they can't accomplish. I mean, they put their mind to it, and this is the way that we've eradicated the vast majority of diseases. You have to keep in mind, pandemics on this global scale were not that uncommon until the Industrial Revolution started innovating, and the medical field was a part of that. And so it just astounds me that there are people right now that are calling for more government intervention and a top-down system with central planning where there is no private sector healthcare, that it's actually even more socialist than Canada would be, where they do still have a private healthcare system alongside their public option. That they just want to do away with all of that and move to a completely government-controlled healthcare system. I don't see how anybody has been paying attention the past 3 weeks and would still hold that belief. I mean, this has been the greatest testament to what the American free market can do when it comes to innovation and being able to handle the science just so much better than the government does. I'm not saying that the government isn't trying to do a good job or anything like that. I'm just saying you open it up to the private sector, these are the kinds of results that you get. You don't have enough ventilators? Oh, we've got people making ventilators out of car factories and people inventing attachments to CPAP machines, which are wildly abundant in the United States, to be converted for just, these plastic parts and, a few $100s. Significantly cheaper than your normal ventilators. And a lot of these people doing so not because they're looking for profit or not, but that would be okay too if they were doing that, but just because they want to help. That's what this country is all about. And that's the reason that I have a great deal of hope in our country and how we're going to be able to handle this. And what drives me nuts is that the media isn't talking about this. These are not the stories that the media is talking about. All they're doing is talking about how bad everything is going to be. And I understand you got to be realistic with people. I try to be too. In a lot of ways, this is going to be something that is really bad for us. But ultimately, my hope outweighs that. And I think the vast majority of us, there's going to be a lot of heartache, but there's also going to be a lot of innovations that comes out of this thing. Let's go ahead and go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's report today comes from the book of 1 Samuel, and I didn't really plan this, but we've kind of been working through the book of 1 Samuel, and so I'm thinking we're just going to stick with this for the next few weeks and kind of go through and do a real in-depth study on it. Now, I've never done one on a book this long. We've done studies on books in Esther and Daniel, but I really think that there is just so much material in 1 Samuel that this is something that would not only be a focus of us for a long period of time, but looking at it comprehensively would be a way that could greatly enhance our understanding of some of the narratives that are contained within it. So to understand what's going on here, because you may recall the last chaplain's report we did was about how the Philistines gathered up and took the Ark of the Covenant. They were worshipers of the idol god Dagon. They took it back to their temple. They laid the Ark of the Covenant in front of their idol Dagon, and they come in and it's fallen down. So now they're very aware of the fact that the Ark of the Covenant is something that's not supposed to be in their possession. Now they still want it in a battle, and they still want to keep that as a trophy to show as their defeat of Israel. But even though they've taken it out of the temple of Dagon now and pulled it away from there, they're now starting to notice other trouble. They take it to Gath, and they notice when they go there that all of the men in the city have been afflicted with tumors. And based on the translation, and this is one of the reasons why I've got to believe that God has a sense of humor. One of the translations that you'll read, and there is some insinuating here in the Hebrew language, is that the tumors sprouted up in their nether regions. So don't tell me God doesn't have a sense of humor here, that when God decides to bring a plague on someone and smite them, for a guy, there's really no worse place that you could have these tumors or sores or whatever they want to refer to them as. And speaking of somebody that's had a tumor in that particular location, I can tell you it's no fun. But anyway, because, I'm a cancer survivor. But they define them as tumors. It was probably more realistically some kind of sore or something like that, which would be a little different. But what's fascinating here is the Philistines realize that this is something that is coming from God, and that they have angered God by keeping his Ark of the Covenant. They've gotten the message loud and clear, and now they have to decide what they're going to do with it. How are they going to take this plague off of them? Well, they don't want to just take it back to the Israelites. And so they get their prophets together and the people who worship their gods and the wise men of the city, and they all confer with one another. It's like, all right, here's what we're going to have to do. It's very clear to us we're going to have to get rid of this thing somehow, because God is not happy with us keeping his ark from the children of Israel. And wherever this thing goes, it causes plagues in whatever city it arrives in. So clearly it's the problem. We've got to figure out a way to get rid of this, because it is clear that God's hand is on us, which always astounded me, because it amazes me how some of the pagans in the biblical narrative seem to have a stronger faith sometimes than even the children of Israel when it comes to God's power and what he can do. Granted, at this point, they had a very good reason for believing that with the tumors that had been afflicting them, and the mice, apparently, that had been afflicting them as well. And so this is the solution that the elders and the wise men of the Philistines come up with. They say, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to give an offering inside the ark. So it's not enough to just give the ark back in a way to appease their God, because keep in mind, they're pagans and they think like pagans. In order to appease their God, what we're going to do is give their God something that we would normally give our God. If we believed our God was mad with us, we will give him an offering of gold. And so what they decide to do is, as a part of their offering, they fashion gold tumors and gold mice. And they put it inside the Ark of the Covenant. And then they put the Ark on the Covenant on a cart. And then without any men manning it, they just take a couple of cattle. And they're the ones pulling the cart. And they just send the cart off in the general direction of Israel, which is fascinating in a lot of ways. They just had faith that the Ark was going to eventually make it to people in Israel, and this thing would be restored, and also that they realized that they had made God mad, and they had to do something to rectify that. So it's interesting that in many ways their assertion was on the right track. And so eventually they're trying to send this thing back to Israel through this means. And what they wind up doing is it gets back to Israel, and what they do is they see it, they open it up, they wind up sacrificing the livestock that were sent there. They sacrifice that to God as a sort of a thank you for bringing the ark back into our custody. And then the men there open up the ark and find these gold tumors and these gold mice that the Philistines have put into the ark. And this is the reaction that God has to it. We'll look in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 19 through 20. So in this particular passage, it states, "He snuck down some of the men of Bethshemesh," remember that's the city that the Ark of the Covenant has come into, "because they had looked into the Ark of the Lord, and struck down all of the people, 50,070 men. And the people mourned because the Lord had struck the people with a great slaughter." Verse 20, "The men of Bethshemesh said, 'Who is able to stand before the Lord, this holy God, and whom shall he go up from us?'" Now, I find this absolutely fascinating because you'll notice that in this verse, God strikes down the people of Bethshemesh because they had opened up the ark and looked inside it. But to get the offerings inside of the ark, the Philistines would have also had to open it. And they would have also had to see what was inside the ark in order to place these things inside there as their offering to God. Another thing that's interesting is that when the Philistines decide to send this thing back, they load it up on a cart and send it on its way. Now, granted, it's possible that we see somebody struck dead on the Philistine side from beforehand, like the first Philistine that touches the ark, that he's struck dead, just like the Israelite that did so a little bit later in the biblical narrative when David brings the Ark of the Covenant back to the city of God. Maybe that happens, but there's no record of it. And there's no record of God being angry with the Philistines for putting this thing on a cart, even though the children of Israel do it later. And he's very mad at them for doing it because they were supposed to get 4 men of the tribe of Levi to carry it. They're not supposed to put it on a cart. So if God is angry at the Israelites for putting his ark on a cart and for opening up the ark, but not mad at the Philistines for doing the same thing, doesn't that make God inconsistent? Doesn't that mean that God has a double standard? Actually, this is something that I had a problem with for a long time, and it bothered me. And the reason that I started to understand that it wasn't is because the difference was what they knew. You see, the laws of Moses that are contained within the Torah, those were laws specifically given only to the children of Israel and something that they had to obey. We'll see, for example, much later in the story of Jonah when he goes to preach at the city of Nineveh. God tells them to repent. God tells them that he is not happy with their behavior and that if they don't repent, he'll destroy their city, and they do. But Jonah never told them to become Jewish. Jonah never told the Ninevites that they have to convert to Judaism and they have to keep the sacrifices and the Sabbaths and all those things. He didn't do that. And just like God did not expect the Ninevites to become Jewish and to adhere to the law of Moses, which they did not have and had not previously known, he didn't hold that against them. He was angry with the Philistines. He obviously punished them not only by destroying their idol, but afflicting them with a plague wherever their ark went. He communicated to them in a very real and obvious way that he was not happy with what they were doing. But what he did not do is hold them accountable for things that they had no way of knowing what they were supposed to do. I find that really interesting, because that means that there are some things that God believes universally human beings are supposed to be accountable for, and they're supposed to just know. The Philistines, based on the information that they had, based on their knowledge of the children of Israel, should have known that they're not supposed to mess with their God, and that if they were to acquire something like the Ark of the Covenant, that God was not going to be happy with them in that. They had enough information to know better than to do that. What they did not have enough information to know better than is to open up the Ark or to put it on a cart to be returned to the children of Israel. And so God did absolutely hold them accountable, but he only held them accountable to the standard by which he had given them specifically and the things that they knew. Because even though putting the Ark of the Covenant on a cart was not something that you were supposed to do, the Philistines didn't know that. And the Philistines actually were trying to rectify their previous mistake by doing so. And so God gives them a little extra leeway. I'm not sure exactly what that would mean for us as modern Christians, because we know that the covenant has now gone from being to the Israelites specifically to universal. That's something that the scripture, the epistles, especially the ones by Paul, make abundantly clear. So I'm not suggesting that this has any implication on us today in the sense that there are some people that aren't expected to conform to the image of God's Son. We know that there was a time of ignorance that God sort of ignored, but now commands all men everywhere to be baptized. That's something that is stated emphatically in the scripture. But what I am saying is, I find it really interesting that God, in his justice, understood that there are certain people that ought to know better, and some that don't. And I think for people that are learned in the scripture, for people that do understand certain aspects of it that other people might not, that maybe, even though there's still one standard, and I think this is something that is backed up by Scripture, that some people, for example, teachers, elders, this is something that is brought up in Corinthians, that we're held to a high standard because we have more knowledge. We have a responsibility that exceeds those of others if our knowledge is increased. And so I think that that's a fascinating thing for us to remember, is that if we're going to be people of the Word, if we're going to be people that study the Bible, and this is something that we are commanded to do, we can't just say, oh, I'd like to be held to a lower standard, so I'm not going to study. Now, that's not how this system works. Because we're commanded to study, and we're commanded to learn as much as we can. And I think that that would put you in danger of your heart not being right with God as well. But ultimately, I do think that it should be a sobering thought to remember that because we do have these blessings and we do have the information that we have, that we are held to a standard and that we are held doubly responsible. And I think that that's something that God has, it's been true of him and his judgments even since Old Testament times. And I think that this verse kind of shows that. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalreda Church of Christ.